Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with debunking the Modal Ontological Argument 6 Ways from Sunday. Today we're going to be looking at the Modal Ontological Argument that has been offered by Inspiring Philosophy. Before I get started, I want to say I have a lot of respect for Inspiring Philosophy. First off, for presenting this version of the argument and putting a lot of time and effort into defending it. As I'm showing through these videos, I find this argument terribly unconvincing. So to put a lot of work into it is really impressive to me. I'd also like to say that this version that's offered by Inspiring Philosophy is one of the more convincing out there on the internet, or at least as far as being offered in a YouTube video. So I'm impressed by that, and that's why I want to respond to this argument. With that said, I'm going to offer a bunch of objections to it. So, the modal ontological argument, as offered by Inspiring Philosophy, goes as follows. It is possible that God, a maximally great being, exists. If it is possible that God, maximally great being, exists, then he exists in some possible worlds. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. If God exists in the actual world, then God, maximally great being, exists. If you know anything about logic, you know that all you have to do to prove this argument is to prove premise 1 and accept the rules of modal logic, and the rest will follow. You've got one job: proving premise 1. We'll take a look at some of the arguments Inspiring Philosophy offers and see if he does a good job of proving premise 1. So, before we get going into this too much, it's important to note that premise 1 can be split up into 1a and 1b. It is possible that God exists, and God is a maximally great being. This is just going to be premises 1 and 2 of the previous modal ontological argument that I offered. And if you were convinced by the objection to that, you should be convinced by the same objection here. It's a fallacy of equivocation of using God twice in fact, the same sentence. But if you weren't convinced by that, let's take a look at some more objections. So, Inspiring Philosophy is going to define maximally great being as a being that possesses all qualities that are better to have, defined as great-making properties. The examples he's going to give are omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. However, I'm a little concerned that these are great-making properties by his own definition. Let's take a look. So, better to have. Is it better to have a shovel or an axe? Well, that depends. Are you going to dig a hole or are you going to chop down a tree? It doesn't seem that having a shovel or having an axe is going to be an objectively better property to have. It depends on what you're going to do. Similarly, omnipotence, we might think, well, if you want to do anything, you would want omnipotence. Here, you could dig a hole, you could chop down a tree. It wouldn't be contingent on what you want to do. It's not going to be kind of that hypothetical good. However, what if you wanted to lack responsibility? What if you wanted to exist and not have the responsibility to be doing things for the world? The more power you have and the more you're able to do, the more responsible you are for the way things turn out. This is kind of similar to the idea behind the problem of evil, in the sense that the reason that God is responsible for the evil in the world is he has power to do something about it. In this case, if you wanted to lack responsibility, you would want no power. It seems in this way that omnipotence is actually something you might not want to have, that it wouldn't be better to have if you wanted to lack responsibility. It seems that there are certain situations where omnipotence is a bad thing, where it's not better to have omnipotence, because with great power comes great responsibility. So, the objection would go as follows. Omnipotence is not always a better thing to have. Great-making properties are things that are always better to have. Therefore, omnipotence is just not a great-making property. That's going to be objection number 2. Omnipotence is not a great-making property, based on this definition. What about better to have? How to make a bomb or how to disarm a bomb. This is knowledge we're talking about. What do you want to do? Do you want to blow something up, or do you want to stop something from blowing up? It seems to be importantly different. Well, maybe you just want to know everything. This would be omniscience. You have omniscience, you're able to do, or rather, you're able to know anything you need to do things. So, omniscience would seem to be the best solution here. There's nothing that would be hypothetical about this. If you want to do this or that, omniscience, you're able to know anything. Once again, however, this seems to be a problem, because it's not going to always be better to have. What if you wanted to have happiness along with your all knowledge? I don't think this is going to work out, because with omniscience, you're going to know every time someone dies. You're going to know every time someone starves to death, and you will know the pain that they feel. It doesn't seem to me that omniscience will give you happiness. In fact, it'll give you a lot of suffering, the suffering of all those that are suffering around the world. In fact, ignorance is what you would rather have for happiness. Why? Because ignorance is bliss. The argument would go as follows. Omniscience is not always a better thing to have. Great-making properties are things that are always better to have. Therefore, omniscience is not a great-making property. So, once again, we are dismantling God's properties. God doesn't seem to be something that is omnipotent or something that is omniscient. That's going to be objection number 3. So, our maximally great being seems to be something that doesn't really seem like our conception of God. But this is a being that possesses all qualities that are better to have, defined as great-making properties, and it's also, we bring in a caveat, a being that has no bad properties like imperfection or corruption. Well, what really are bad properties? That's a little worrisome. I don't even think that imperfection is necessarily a bad property. Take a look. Imperfection isn't always going to be something bad. If you're an emerald or you're a diamond, in fact, imperfections are going to be better for you to have. It's going to be better to have imperfections if you're a gemstone because it makes you original or it makes you unique. I think there's some interesting arguments that might be offered for people similarly having imperfections might make them better. So, here, objection number 4, imperfection is not necessarily a bad property. It might be a better-making property. It might be a great-making property. So right now we have an imperfect God that's not omnipotent or omniscient. Sounds pretty human to me. Now, here is the key point. One great-making property is necessity. This is existing in all possible worlds. We've gotten rid of a lot of God's properties already based on our definition, but if God is necessary, God is still going to exist in all possible worlds and exist. So this is going to be something important for us to look at. So, is necessity better to have? Well, if we want to do anything, we want to have omnipotence. If we want to know anything, we want to have omniscience. What would we want if we end up with necessity? What do you get from existing in possible worlds that are not the actual world? I'm really confused by why you would even want necessity in the first place. Maybe you just want to exist in all possible worlds. Once again, I don't see the good or the benefit that comes out of this, but let's say you do. You would have necessity. But conversely, maybe you're suicidal. You don't even want to exist in this world. Why would you want to exist in all possible worlds? So necessity doesn't seem to always be a good thing to have. Or maybe you're the person that exists in the best possible world for yourself. You wouldn't want to exist in other worlds where you're in fact less. It seems that this conception of necessity, I don't know why it's a property you would want to have, that it would be better to have, and I think there's a lot of situations where people in fact wouldn't want necessity. So, the argument goes as follows. Necessity is not always a better thing to have. I might even argue that it's not ever a better thing to have. Great-making properties are things that are always better to have. Therefore, necessity is not a great-making property. That's objection number 5. Necessity, not a great-making property. You might say that it's better to have necessity because if you are necessary, you exist in all possible worlds. However, that's just the definition of necessary. It is better to be necessary because if you're necessary, then you're necessary. That's not convincing to anyone. It doesn't explain anything to me about why I would want to be necessary. Why is it better to exist in all possible worlds? Why is it better to be necessary? You have not answered this question. So, great-making properties. If you know anything about Kant, I'm kind of going through a proof to show that these are hypothetical goods. They're good for something. If you want to do anything, you would want to be omnipotent. If you want to know everything, you would want to be omniscient. But only if you want to do those things. They're not categorical goods. These are things that are goods in themselves. The problem is, we have not shown that the properties we want God to possess are goods in themselves, and I don't even think we've shown that necessity is something that's a good for doing something. It's not even a hypothetical good, let alone a categorical good. Once again, the only premise that must be defended is the first one. Yet, we have pretty much dismantled, simply based on our definition, God as he is, and offered no argument for the first premise. We're not going to offer defense to the first premise. If we are not convinced by the first premise, we are not going to be convinced by the argument, because it all rests on that premise. If we split it up into 1A and 1B, if we accept these two premises, then God follows. That's what the ontological argument seems to show. But we have been given no reason to accept either premise. All you had to do was give us reasons to accept these statements. You had one job. And yet, we still have not been given a reason to accept either that it is possible that God exists or that God is a maximally great or necessary being. In fact, it seems that God being a maximally great or necessary being has been drawn into question by the definition we've offered of maximal greatness. So, there is no reason to accept 1A or 1B objection number 6. Tomorrow we're going to be taking a look at some of the responses that inspiring philosophy gives to a number of objections that are out there, and I will be offering objection to every single one of those responses. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and watch a new video every single day on Debunking the Modal Ontological Argument 6 Ways from Sunday. Stay skeptical, everybody.